Hello and welcome to EarthBeat. I'm joined here today by Dr. Sylvia Hood Washington, an environmental epidemiologist, an environmental engineer, and an environmental historian who's worked on environmental justice issues for upwards of 40 years. Most recently at her own company, Environmental Health Research Associates. She's the founding editor of the academic peer-reviewed journal Environmental Justice, which she edited for 12 years, and she is a secular Franciscan. So Dr. Hood Washington, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the great introduction, Jesse.
Thank you. All right, so let's jump in. So what I wanted to start with was this question. What do you think all Catholics need to understand about environmental justice and environmental racism?
I think all Catholics should understand that environmental justice and environmental racism is a right to life issue, unequivocally. This is not about politics. This is about the sanctity of life from conception. And I emphasize the conception because I am an unabashedly pro-life person. And I believe that life begins at conception. By extension, and just as importantly, as we conceive life, especially human beings, but all life, but especially human beings, because that's what environmental justice is about. At issue here is the disruption of human integrity during conception. So as an environmental epidemiologist, I'm sure that term has been tossed around, epidemiologist. I'm an environmental epidemiologist, and so we understand in our training, in our research, that life is actually degraded in the womb from exposures to chemicals. So if we are to be created in God's image, as God intended us to be, then we will make sure that a developing fetus is not corrupted at birth in the womb, right? So environmental justice, environmental racism, a deeper dig into it will show you, especially when it first began. I've read a lot of material as an environmental historian, and I was sort of interested because really preceding what the environmental justice movement proclaimed founders will say is that it began in '78. I will argue with anyone to say that environmental justice, the concept of environmental health degradation began with Lois Gibbs in Love Canal, where you were having people who were having disrupted pregnancies and the development of cancer. So if you want the integrity of life, as God intended us to be, not what damaged DNA. So there's a whole field of it called environmental genomics. Not what damaged DNA, not what a reduction in the lifespan and a reduction of life quality because they develop cancer by being exposed to toxicants.
Thank you for that. And in your answer, you touched on, your knowledge of history. Well, I kind of want to zone in right now on this moment. So in recent years, the climate movement has brought the concept of environmental justice and environmental mainstream a lot more, or environmental racism a lot more into the mainstream. And COVID-19 has brought more attention to existing health disparities between different groups. Mm-hmm. In recent weeks, our country has really been grappling with systemic racism and violence against people of color. So, as someone who has studied and worked on these issues for decades, what do you make of this moment right now as you're seeing it?
So as I said, before we started, I said I was talking to one of my fellow Franciscans who was a biologist. So when you have a degradation of the human fetus from environmental exposures, I'm going to give a specific example. Flint, Michigan, right, was in the news right when a Laudato Si was, had emerged. I am appointed by the governor of Illinois as an environmental justice commissioner for the state of Illinois. And I'm the Illinois EPA elected co-chair, environmental justice advisory group. So this was like right in there happening at the same time. If individuals understood what lead does to the body, right? We know that lead exposures in the womb, and this is fantastic research that's gone on since then, actually changes the brain of children, creating learning disabilities. And at one point in time, there was like some statistic, like 30% of all incarcerated individuals were exposed to lead. So these environments have been exposed to chemicals since the Industrial Revolution. Now, as an environmental historian, I'm actually a historian of science, technology, environment, and medicine. And in my PhD research and then my first book was based on this. So when these African Americans and immigrants migrated out of rural agrarian societies into a rapidly industrialized environment, urban environment, they were exposed to chemicals. Now, depending on how they were perceived in terms of race, because race is fluid. People who were Irish were not considered white when they came to the United States. People who were Italian were not considered white when they came to the United States. Eastern Europeans were not considered white. So they were all pushed into industrial environments, from rural agrarian environments, exposed to chemicals, because there was no OSHA, there was no public health when they came in. So these individuals, communities who were left in these environments have been exposed to chemicals, and their immune systems have been degraded over generations. Then you lay on top of that exposure to chemicals like lead, so that you have individuals who not only have their immune systems been compromised over generations, now you have people changing mentally, not just like how they think, well, it is psychologically, but their actual brains have been damaged by chemicals in the environment. So this is a powder cake, and it didn't begin today. It's sort of sad, because the issues that we face today were the issues that we faced at the beginning of the 20th century. And so these rural agrarian societies moving in, coming into factories, doing industrial work, bodies being transformed, the exposures that they had back then, it lasted generations. This is not like, oh, my dad got exposed to lead, my mom got exposed to lead, but now we've moved on up and moved into a better, cleaner environment. No, it follows you. The chemicals are in the body, and some of the chemicals are leached during conception. So all of this, like COVID-19, of course, African Americans and people of color and immigrants, I don't care what, white, Hispanic, African, if they are moving into these urban spaces without any environmental protection, working on jobs where they feel afraid and exposed to chemicals, we are in a toxic, situation, in a volatile situation, which is why you see this protest, because these people, they have a higher risk of developing COVID-19, and they come out and they feel like they are being policed, and we just don't know where they're coming from in terms of how they're able to think, but they are overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed by histories of cancer, histories of early death, and many times it's tied to the environmental pollution that they grew up over generations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned Laudato Si at the beginning of your answer, and I know you've spoken about the encyclical in the past. I'm wondering how you think that ties in to, or if you can explain, to people how that ties into environmental justice and environmental racism from your perspective, and why it's such an important document for this moment, as you're saying, to move us forward.
I was flabbergasted when I read Laudato Si. I'm really serious. I love Pope Francis, and I love the fact that he took all of those researchers and scholars and brought that together, because I have never read in my life, as a historian and scientist and engineer, someone who could weave a narrative about how we are changing all of God's creation. All of God's creation. Laudato Si is not just about solar panels. It is not. He is talking about the integrity of all life, and how the integrity of all life is compromised by our actions. And if you cannot grasp the fact that what we do on an individual basis and take in terms of making decisions will have actual life-changing consequences for those who are different from us and those who we perceive as less, then we have missed the boat in terms of our catechesis. All right. So, when I went to COP21, the Conference of Parties 21 in France, 2015, and Pope Francis was, he was there because he had just released Laudato Si. What was striking at COP21 was a gallery of all these posters on what climate change was doing to people's lives all over the world, how people were dying, how people were losing their homes from erosions of beaches and things are sinking. But here's the other thing that was happening at COP21, where Pope Francis, like a key participant, was they were predicting pandemics and vector-borne diseases. Now, I hope this is not too much for everyone, but take, for instance, malaria. And we talked about this when as an epidemiologist, we know that at a certain point in time, malaria is associated with hot climates, lots of, moisture, water. Well, with climate change, right? Not climate warming, climate change, because it's not climate, it's climate change. They were predicting that areas that were not the same as malaria environments in the past would become those types of environments. And so you would have a rise of vector-borne diseases. When you have melting of areas where you've had ice for thousands of years, you're going to release bacteria and viruses, which we have never seen in thousands and thousands of years. So right now, we're like predicting a heat wave in the United States. Everything is changing. We are creating an environment where we're going to have more diseases, more vector-borne diseases. We're going to have viruses and bacteria that we've never seen before because of the way in which the planet is changing. So 5 years ago, that was pretty much discussed in a number of panels about how we would have a change in vector-borne diseases, rises in pandemics tied to climate change.
You mentioned, how important it was to them, or that exhibit, the impact of climate change on people's lives. I understand that climate change has had an effect on your life, and I was wondering if you would be willing to share that story with us.
So, I'm not from Chicago, I'm originally from Ohio. And I'm blessed to have 2 live children. And my 3rd child would have been born in 1995. And that was the Chicago heat wave that we lost all of the heating in our home. And I went into stress. My husband, we got out of there, but very viable pregnancy. But because of the way I was born, my body couldn't take the heat. And I ended up having a miscarriage after 6 months. So heat waves it impacts people's health, and it impacts the health of the unborn, unfortunately.
Understood. So going back to Laudato Si and what you were saying about that, how important that document is, at the U.S. Bishops' Conference Fall Assembly in 2019, then President Cardinal Daniel DiNardo was asked if the bishops consider climate change to be an urgent threat. And I was there at that press conference, and he said that at that point in time, climate change was not yet urgent. It was important, but it wasn't yet urgent. And I was wondering, from your perspective as a scientist, as someone who studied this, and even someone who's been impacted by this, what would you say to bishops who don't consider these issues, climate change and environmental justice, top priority for the church in this country? What would you say to them?
I would say, please invite Catholic scholars like myself into a room and have a discussion. Because I think what has happened, we'll put the historian hat on right now. There has been, at least in the media, and at least how environmental issues have been communicated, a decoupling of the narrative from life issues. They'll talk about social equity, they'll talk about economic parity, but the bishops need to understand that the science of climate change and the science of environmental pollution is a science, are sciences that deal with the integrity of human life. If you're pro-life, then you would want every human being to have that ability to be born as God's creation. If you're a human being and we do want to save babies, we really do want to save babies. But if I say to you, if you do not make climate change a priority, then that non-action, that encouragement not to participate will leave millions who are going to die in the womb, right? Who are going to be compromised from deformity. You saw it in the Zika virus. You saw that with that vector-borne disease. It's going to cause deformities. It's going to cause spontaneous abortions. It's going to cause, deaths from heat waves. And in those individuals living in the urban environments, this heat island effect, which happened in Chicago, wiping out hundreds. It is death. And by not addressing it, we are contributing or turning away from our fellow man dying. This is not about, really for me, climate change is not about solar panels. I think that's great, but for me, as an epidemiologist and Catholic, it's about saving lives from conception to natural death.
Yeah, and I know you've spoken before as well. I watched your 2017 homily, and action is really important for you and calling people to action. And again, coming back to this moment where we're seeing all these protests on the street and environmental justice and environmental racism really elevated in the conversation. I'm going to ask you to put your historian hat back on again. I'm wondering how can the movement use that history that you studied in a way to continue the conversation and push it forward? Why is that history so valuable, and what drew you to make that transition from being an engineer to being a historian?
Well, actually, so it's funny that you say that, because how did I get a PhD in the history of science, technology, and environment? So I got this PhD in the history of science, technology, and environment. It was sponsored by NASA. At this time I started my PhD, we were trying to do environmental policy and trying to look at how technology was changing lives after the 1987 Challenger disaster. And at the time, NASA was starting to launch nuclear materials into space. And so we need to go back and look at the history of our engineering and history of public health and medicine tied to nuclear waste, okay? So history, engineers, NASA would pay for my history of science, technology, environment to understand the relationship between public health and technology and science. Now, that's a history part, that's another history part. Now in my book, and then I published another paper called Mrs. Black Beautiful. This is the interesting thing. When I did that research, what I found was that people of color and immigrants were always struggling with environmental health issues. Whether it was the Eastern immigrants in the back of the yards fighting off vector-borne diseases from waste accumulating from the Chicago stockyards, or African Americans who were legally segregated, okay? This is like legal segregation, were fighting with an epidemic of TB, which was actually an environmental disease in the sense that it was an anaerobic vector that required closed spaces and no light. This is pre-civil rights movement. And what you see when you dig into the research, which is, you have to dig because it's not out there easily, you see these organizations working with churches, with other communities to galvanize and change their actual living spaces, and therefore promoting life. So it's sort of interesting because when the African Americans were doing this, they were coming into Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, like 1900, 1918. and just working together across racial lines, across class lines, to make their communities more sustainable. And we cannot despair. It doesn't matter who is in office. This is what history tells you. As long as you are guided by faith, you can reach across the aisle, and I'm a Franciscan, and you can see everyone as a full reflection of the face of God. So we can't, you know, people out there protesting, I understand that. I mean, I'm African American, I'm a big Catholic family, I'm one of 8, the baby of 8. I have 4 brothers, I have, you know, nephews. That violence is real, but we need to come back and we need to become resilient. And we need to represent everyone, bring everyone to the table and make our communities resilient, you know, regardless of who's in office. So I hope I answered your question. I get a little.
No, definitely. And I think my last question I was planning on asking was, where does the conversation need to go from here? But I think you've answered that in a lot of different ways, really important elements. So I guess to end, you know, wrap up our conversation, where can people go to learn more? Where would you recommend? What do they need to research? Are there books that people should read? You know, where and how can people learn more to keep this conversation going and keep it relevant?
I think if people want to understand the history of people of color and immigrants from over 100 years ago, how they built resilient communities, they should go to my book, Packing Them In, An Archaeology of Environmental Racism in Chicago, 1865 to 1954. I am shocked at how relevant that book is today, because I was like freaking out with all the news, because packing them in is multiple entendre. It's not a double entendre. Packing them in is about the packing house industry and the unsafe OSHA environment when there was no OSHA in the packing house industry. Packing them in is about individuals being pushed into housing, unsustainable housing, and how that housing caused disease. The housing that we have now in these urban environments are going to contribute to COVID-19, because COVID-19 is now considered like microparticles in air circulation. That was meaning, and for TB, again, it was anaerobic, it needed a closed environment. So, and then we go into the back of the yards. And so here we have neighborhoods who, through no part of their own, they reversed the Chicago River so that the white gentry in Chicago along the lake would not get, you know, typhoid and all the other diseases associated with waste products in the water stream. They reversed the Chicago River to put it in the backyards of Eastern European immigrants, right? But that book also talks about how these individual groups work in collaboration. So that is an inspiring story. And I ended 1954, which is like right when the civil rights movement is really taking off. So that whole story is pre-civil rights, right? We can go pre-civil rights and see collaboration in creating sustainable communities. Another book that my edited collection, Echoes from the Poisoned Well, Global Memories of Environmental Injustice, that's a great set of edited collections, because it's all over the world and how communities struggle all over the world, what they did to build sustainable communities and how they worked across the aisle. I think the church, I mean, yes, I am Roman Catholic and I love my faith. But if I step back objectively, look at it, we are a global institution. We have one of the best individuals possible who are leading us, our Holy See, Pope Francis, who has articulated this relationship between what we do individually and how it impacts the rest of the world. People, please remember, when we were all in quarantine, look what happened to the earth. Do you remember seeing those visions? Everything was becoming beautiful. So our individual actions collectively had degraded the earth. And just by going in by a few weeks, we saw blue skies, we saw wildlife coming out, because that's how much of an impact humans have on the rest of the earth. Read Laudato Si, number one.
Read Laudato Si.
Read Laudato Si.
Thank you so
I-
much for
yeah,
joining us.
you're welcome.
Is there any, I'll just, you know, 1 minute, any last thoughts, anything we didn't touch on you want to close out?
People don't have to be activists, right? They don't have to be marching in the streets to create sustainable communities, livelihoods. I just, you know, like for instance, Flint, Michigan, do one thing. The people in Flint, Michigan still are too afraid to drink the water. Even if your parish organized a water donation for the children of Flint, Michigan, they could do that, right? The parish can organize something, organize a collection to be given to bring fresh water, you know, to a family for 1 month or 2 months, whatever you come up with. We can take action. When we see these heat waves coming, then what can we do, right? If people don't have an environment where they can cool down and live. So just having that conversation within the parish. And I want to just do a shout out to Bishop, he's retired, Bishop Marty Amos, who was in Iowa, who was my pastor when I was an environmental engineer and struggling with what I was observing in terms of environmental violations by my industry. And he guided me. He helped me with that moral and ethical dilemma, because there are good Catholics and they're engineers on jobs or scientists, and they're being asked to do things that they know is life robbing and life destructive. And so we need to have pastors like Father, now Bishop Amos, who can guide us and direct us to resources. I think the parish priest is extremely important, and so are the catechists in the parish, understanding these connections between life and the environment. That's why they have to read Laudato Si.
Read Laudato Si, there it is again. Dr. Hood, thank you so much for joining us, and readers, thank you for watching. We appreciate it. Have a good one.
Thank you so much.